Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of De Justicia, we are pleased to welcome you to this event. We'd like to thank who have helped us prepare this launch and who have made it possible for it to go out in both Spanish and English. Today, we are meeting to share with you the launch of a report we've been working on for the last 2 years, Defending Human Rights in Venezuela, the purpose of which is to give visibility to the challenges and difficulties faced by civil society organizations in the Venezuelan human rights movement in general when it comes to doing their day-to-day work, but which also seeks to talk about their mechanisms of resilience and the different forms of support that they have received from other organizations in the region, and also draw attention to the recommendations that we believe are important, which they themselves have promoted through this research project in order to continue strengthening human rights work in Venezuela, despite the great challenges. Today, we are accompanied by 4 excellent panelists and also a moderator who is associated with De Justicia. I'm going to introduce them, or we will introduce them as they take the floor. You can see this event in Spanish through the Facebook channel on De Justicia, or in English through the YouTube channels of WOLA and De Justicia.
To the De Justicia and WOLA YouTube channel. Entonces, pues le voy a dar la palabra.
So I'm going to give the floor now to Ligia Bolívar. She is going to be our moderator for this discussion. She's a sociologist from the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, and she's a human rights specialist at Universidad Central of Venezuela. She has worked in teaching, training, advocacy and consultancies in human rights. She was a fellow at De Justicia for a year, and during that time she worked with Ezequiel Monsalve, who was also a De Justicia fellow. They worked together on this research study. So Ligia and Ezequiel will tell you a bit more about what the report is about. And we also have with us the UN Special Rapporteur for the Rights of Human Rights Defenders, Ms. Mary Lawlor, and also Marianna Romero from the Center for Human Rights Defenders and Justice, and also Geoff Ramsey, who are going to present some further considerations about the situation of human rights defenders in Venezuela. So thank you very much, welcome. And I now give the floor over to Ligia. Very well, good morning. So we'll begin with Mary Lawlor. Mary is currently Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, United Nations Special Rapporteur, and this since May of 2020. She's also a professor at the Trinity University School of Business in Dublin, where she also works on the issue of business and human rights, and she's also a member of its advisory board. She has worked in depth on the situation of human rights defenders internationally, and indeed she was the founder of the international organization Frontline Defenders, which no doubt all human rights defenders who are with us today are familiar with. And no doubt you have a lot to thank, a lot of gratitude to express for the support offered by Frontline in Venezuela. Mary was not only a founder, but she was also its executive director for more than 15 years. So Mary, to begin with, what is the general perception of the situation of human rights defenders internationally today, and particularly in Venezuela?
Microphone, please.
Thank you all very much. And first of all, I'd like to extend greetings to everyone. It's a very important report that you're launching. I haven't read it all yet, I have to say, because it's quite long, but over time I will do better. So human rights defenders are people, as you know, who work peacefully to defend, strengthen, and protect the rights of others. As Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, my job is to try and promote the work of these people and to do what I can to support them where they are at risk. I've been in the position for almost a year now, And because I haven't been able to travel like all of you, I've spent a lot of my time talking to defenders from different countries in online meetings. And the point for me of these online meetings is to hear from defenders about the issues that they face, so that I might understand their situations better and try and come up collectively with them in ways in which I can help as special rapporteur. I found the overall picture to be two-sided. On the one hand, it's all very troubling, as human rights defenders are being persecuted all around the world for the work they do. And it often seems that the challenges that they are facing are growing rather than decreasing, in particular in the context of the pandemic. In my first report to the Human Rights Council, for example, I looked at the killings of human rights defenders, which are recurring year on year in huge numbers and almost always resting in impunity. But on the other hand, I've heard from defenders this last year, and it has been inspiring the kind of things that they have been doing. They don't just go away, and they aren't backing down in the face of danger or in the face of the challenges that they're facing. Rather, they're driving on all around the world, finding new strength and new ways to overcome the obstacles in front of them. And the level of organization, determination, and resilience shown by defenders, and especially those most at risk and marginalized, is really amazing. Many of the defenders I've spoken to have been from Latin America, where defenders in almost every country face very serious obstacles as they go about their work. The terrible continuation of killings of human rights defenders is particularly pronounced in several countries in the region, but there are many other extremely worrying issues too, like the criminalization of land, indigenous and environmental defenders. They're being subjected to long periods of detention without trial, in particular when they challenge business interests, and a backlash and a dreadful targeting of women's rights defenders, both online and offline. Earlier this year, I met a group of human rights defenders from Venezuela and heard from them about the specific issues faced by those defending human rights in their country. It was an extremely useful meeting, but very troubling. I was told of the deterioration of the situation for human rights defenders. The climate for defending human rights has come to be defined by intimidation and persecution, with an increase in arbitrary arrests, systematic criminalization and threats, and smear campaigns being used against defenders and civil society, both online and in the traditional media. Many of the issues are reflected in the report being launched today, and they're things that we've also seen in other countries, not just in Latin America, but in other regions of the world, such as the use of foreign agent smears to delegitimize the work of human rights defenders and human rights organizations, with connected restrictions on foreign funding, as well as the targeting of humanitarian actors and journalists. As I see it, these are regressive tactics employed to repress civil society and the work of human rights defenders. And I often think that repression is a sign of the effectiveness of human rights defenders. They have to be seen as a warning bell because they suggest that the space for doing human rights work is at risk of closing completely. And that means that there will have to be greater effort to support those promoting and protecting human rights in the country. I've already communicated concerns about the situation to the government with other special rapporteurs in an unofficial communication, but so far, as yet, there has been no response. So I'll be trying to follow up. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Mary.
Thank you very much, Mary. no doubt in the next part, we'll have an opportunity to go into more depth on many of the issues that you've noted. I would now like to introduce Marianna Romero. She is an attorney with a degree from the Andrés Bello Catholic University of Venezuela, where she currently is academic coordinator and professor at the Center for Human Rights. She's also Director General of the Center for Defenders and Justice in Venezuela. This is a non-governmental organization engaged in human rights promotion and protection work, aimed mainly at strengthening the justice and democratic institutions, as well as defense and comprehensive defense and protection of human rights defenders. Welcome, Marianna. I wanted to ask you, mindful of the regular monitoring work done by your organization, what are the risks faced by human rights organizations in Venezuela when it comes to doing their work, and what types of attacks have they been victims of? Thank you, Ligia, and I thank De Justicia for the invitation to this important activity and to the presentation of this report. Having read the entire report, it really puts forward fundamental contributions, particularly in relation to needs for accompaniment and support in Venezuelan civil society, particularly organizations that are on the ground and in the face of the increasingly hostile and adverse context in which they need to do their work. In that vein, we start from exemplifying how application of the national security doctrine based on the logic of the internal enemy has become deeper and deeper with the passage of time over the years. And we have seen, at least from 2018 to date, how the march forward of this policy of criminalization has been translated into greater restrictions, greater limitations. And one example of this is that at our organization, Centers for Defenders and Justice, in 2020, we presented a joint report with international and national organizations such as the Observatory for Human Rights, made up the OMTC and the FIDH, as well as other national organizations, the Office of the Vicaret and COFAVIC, where we evidenced 121 attacks against human rights organizations and human rights defenders. Then the Center for Defenders and Justice in 2020 documented 303 situations that compromised the lives of human rights defenders and the operational nature of their organizations. And if we look at 2021, in just the first 3 months of the year, we have seen a total of 181 situations that evidence in those restrictions on the right to defend human rights and accompany victims, and the work of reporting all of these violations that are taking place in Venezuela. If we compare the first quarter of 2021 with the first quarter of 2020, well, we see that deepening of an advance of criminalization with a 250% increase in such attacks and security incidents that we have been able to document in our organization. Understanding that in the first quarter of 2020, we were able to document 51 situations, and so far in 2021, 181 incidents that reflect that application of the state policy of repression and social control, which also takes in human rights defenders, calling them internal enemies of the state. And in this context, the main risks and threats and attacks that we have been able to record as patterns that have become systematic and established are based on and fit in the context of the harassment, surveillance, intimidation, not only by security officers, but also by members who are part of what is known as the People's System for Protection of Peace, which has structures that run parallel to the structures created by the state, also to generate terror and to carry out attacks against human rights organizations and human rights defenders, particularly in vulnerable communities. Moreover, the stigmatization, the smear campaigns, accusations leveled against persons who are said to be terrorists, enemies, the destabilizers, the coup plotters, is another fundamental pattern that we've identified and on which seem to be the basis of so many more violent attacks that compromise the life, integrity, and freedom of persons. These campaigns, these calls to violence and calls to hatred tend to lead to arbitrary arrests, which we've also documented, forced disappearances, and even acts of torture and mistreatment against human rights defenders who, moreover, are subjected to criminal prosecution, such as the case of Azul Positivo, or Positive Blue, in which they are accused of asset laundering, terrorism-related crimes. And this is part of the whole march forward of criminalization. But in addition to these attacks, we see restrictions on the possibility of having access to information, access to public institutions, even the possibility of representing in criminal proceedings victims of human rights violations. We've also noted greater limitations on the possibility of registering organizations or updating their charters or shareholder minutes, which also aggravates the possibility of freely exercising the right to defend human rights in Venezuela. Another important point that I should highlight are the reprisals for cooperating with international human rights systems and the criminalization of international cooperation. It being understood that just because one receives resources, even though this is a right that is recognized by international human rights law, the organizations are categorized, as I had said earlier, as enemies, as meddlers, among other things, and they could be subjected to different kinds of prosecution due to this whole policy of criminalization, and I think I will leave it at that. Thank you very much, Marianna, for your initial remarks, this very worrisome picture. And we're now going to give the floor to Ezequiel Monsalve. He is the lead author of the book that we're presenting today. Ezequiel is an attorney and a university professor at the Andres Bello Catholic University. He has a master's in criminal justice from the Carlos III University in Madrid. He's worked in research, advocacy, and litigation, especially in defending political prisoners in Venezuela. He was indeed a fellow at De Justicia, which was the base where he carried out this research work from. And he's now working on issues relating to the judicial system, rule of law, and disappearance of persons in Venezuela. Welcome, Ezequiel. You, as the lead author of this research study that we're launching today, tell us a bit, where did the idea come from? What are the motivations? And what are the main barriers that the organizations that are described in this report are facing? Go ahead. I thank you, Ligia. I thank De Justicia and all the other panelists and all those who have tuned in. Well, to begin with, as Ligia has mentioned, this research study was carried out in the context of a fellowship in 2019, where basically, well, it's related to work that De Justicia had already been involved in for some time, which answers to earlier work done in the context of certain spaces of civil society, the situation of authoritarian governments, and also a line of work that De Justicia has maintained, and where Ligia and I were able to carry forward as fellows, which is supporting human rights internationally. This is significant work. And we will look in a greater depth at how this is effective as part of the recommendations. There are basically two main motivations. One, to amplify the voices of human rights defenders in the region and vice versa, and also give visibility to the precarious situation that we human rights defenders are suffering in Venezuela now and for some time. Finally, through this assessment, we wanted to make a number of recommendations in order to strengthen cooperation so that it could be much more assertive than it had been as of 2019. I should note that human rights defenders in Venezuela, as Marianna has noted, well, we are experiencing a totally hostile state, but also the civil space has been totally repressed. This has been mentioned by an organization that monitors this. We are practically have a totally closed civic space. This is dramatic, and in light of current concerns, we're heading in this direction. General concerns of human rights defenders, we need to deal with the justice system like human rights defenders anywhere. And second, it's a hostile government that persecutes, that assassinates, and that jails dissidents. And finally, in the context of vulnerability, there's the problem of the economic, social, culture, environmental rights, where access to employment is limited and civil society space is closed. Among the barriers we've identified in the text, we would characterize them into major groups. One group, which we would call direct barriers, and the other indirect barriers. The direct barriers, for those who are interested in the criminal law, have to do with the intent of the state. For civil society, in this case, human rights defenders be unable to do their work. It's designed for that. And the indirect barriers is where the state assumes that these barriers, even though their direct purpose is not to limit the work of human rights defenders, certainly do limit it in light of the state policy and government policy we have at this time. And now, what are these direct or intentional barriers, as I mentioned at the outset? We characterize at least 3 of them. They're very well detailed in the report. The first, which Marianna emphasized, personal safety and integrity of human rights defenders. This ranges from censorship threat, repression, and even the relationship between armed groups and the work of human rights defenders in areas where there are armed groups operating. This is the case, for example, in the state of Bolívar. Second, the absence of state institutions. It's no secret to anyone that there are major limitations in official offices. This limits the research work that can be done. Opacity is one of the main problems going back, say, at least 15 years. There are no official figures from any institution on anything at all. One example, I was recently working with research on access to justice. They were looking at gender studies, and there are no figures since 2006 on femicide. So it's very difficult to manage a situation when you don't have any data. Finally, as the last direct barrier, the legislative and financial restrictions that have been imposed by the state. 15 laws have been aimed not only at restricting access to international financing, but also aimed at criminalizing those engaged in human rights work. And it's that second block of indirect ones. These are, that is to say, they are not intentionally used for these purposes, but the state has adopted them as general policies towards society at large. There's access to public services. This is the main problem that Venezuelans are facing. We don't have electricity, we don't have water, and the weakening of the internal structure of civil society organizations is a true drama. We are fewer and fewer, occupying more limited spaces, and the context of around our work has more and more deteriorated. Second, in light of the country's economic situation, inflation, extreme poverty, according to COFI, over half of Venezuelans are poor. And the sanctions that have been imposed against the Venezuelan state, which have an impact on Venezuelan civil society, since certain international financing programs are not able to come in. And finally, the limited relations that civil society organizations have with donors. In the sample in the report, it was clear that at least 3 organizations have no financing at all. And the average number of sources of financing per organization is 1. So there's very little interaction with sources of financing. And this means that human rights defenders must try to find other employment. There are human rights defenders, as in my own case, we have 3 different work activities in order to be able to cover our day-to-day expenses. I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you. Thank you, Ezequiel. And in the face of this very adverse outlook, I'd like to now hear from Geoff perspectives from a somewhat more distant but not far off point of view. So welcome, Geoff. He's the director for Venezuela of the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA. And in his work, he has been supporting policies that foster a peaceful and negotiated solution to the Venezuelan crisis that address the most urgent humanitarian needs and is supporting a humane response to the unique needs of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Before joining WOLA, Geoff was a consultant for the Latin America program of Open Society Foundations, and he also carried out investigative work with Insight Crime. Geoff, mindful of the work you've done in WOLA, how do you see how do you evaluate the support that other social organizations, funding sources, and other actors in the region have given to civil society organizations in Venezuela? That's to say, what has been done and what remains to be done? Thank you very much, Ligia. Before beginning, I'd like to thank De Justicia for this opportunity and congratulate you for on this very valuable report. In terms of your question, Ligia, as to what has been done to support civil society organizations in Venezuela, I believe that there has been an emphasis on defending certain spaces, strengthening a independent human rights movement that is independent of political parties with a domestic and international presence. The truth is that I have only admiration for our Venezuelan colleagues as they continue to do their very important work in the face of very difficult challenges. I think that in some international fora, I see this in certain circles in Washington, there's a false stereotype that the dynamic in Venezuela is dead, that there is no resistance to the authoritarianism and repression, that there's not a day-to-day activism. And the truth is that this assessment could not be further from the truth. Every time that we in WOLA bring together Venezuelans to talk with political actors in Washington, we think it's been fundamental to show that there is an active human rights movement in Venezuela. There is a civil society in Venezuela that continues to stand up. So in Venezuela, it's my sense that the human rights movement has scored certain major successes, and we need to continue to figure out ways to express solidarity with domestic civil society actors. But where I would put greater emphasis would be on international and regional spaces or forums. The truth is that in the last 2 or 3 years, there has been an undervaluing of regional and international activism, perhaps a negligence with respect to everything having to do with multilateralism, especially in the North and especially in the United States. I believe that the Venezuelan civil society actors have always had a significant presence in international bodies, but there could be greater emphasis on what a multilateral response to the Venezuelan crisis means. I believe that there could be more participation in the formal international organizations. The OAS, I think, might be of limited use on the ground, but in the last 2 years, we have seen tremendous growth of the involvement of the United Nations in Venezuela, particularly in the context of the humanitarian crisis. One question could be whether the United Nations, be it the Secretary General or the Security Council, could play a more active role in responding to the political crisis in Venezuela. And if there is a role for international actors to engage in advocacy to show solidarity with human rights defenders in Venezuela, including friends such as Marianna and Ligia, if we can support you in your efforts to have a greater impact or do more advocacy in those international spaces. That, I believe, is an important line of advocacy work. And I think that more emphasis could be placed on that area of work. Thank you. Thank you very much, Geoff. I wanted to remind you that you can forward questions through the YouTube and Facebook channels of both De Justicia and WOLA. And I'd also like to remind you that in the social networks of De Justicia and WOLA, you'll be able to find the link for downloading the report. What has been presented to us in this first round of remarks shows us a growing adversity in the setting in which human rights defenders do their work in Venezuela, with ever greater criminalization of human rights defenders and also an asphyxiation of the organizations through regulatory measures that are ever more restrictive, repressing or limiting their sources of financing. The report also shows a general situation of limitations faced by the entire population. And since human rights defenders are not in the stratosphere, but rather in a very specific place called Venezuela, this also affects their work a great deal. It has to do with travel, access to internet, access to information. That is to say, this very difficult day-to-day situation affecting any resident of Venezuela also affects human rights defenders in Venezuela. And this is a further aspect that limits and obstructs the performance of their work. What else can be done to mitigate the perverse impact of the situation and to provide greater support to those who work in Venezuela defending human rights vis-a-vis so many violations of all sorts? In the second round, we'd like to focus on this topic, beginning with Marianna in this case. Marianna, since last year, we have seen an aggravation of the persecution that you were just mentioning of human rights organizations through different strategies. Could you tell us a little bit more about that escalation and how criminalization, control, and obstruction of the work of the organizations plays out in practice? Thank you, Ligia. Yes, in effect, if we're going to talk about this point, we need to go back to 2002, which is when we were beginning to see how the Venezuelan state was beginning to build a legal and factual framework to facilitate criminalization of the work of defending and demanding human rights with laws such as the Law on National Security of 2002. Subsequently, in 2005, we saw reforms to the criminal code, and from there, limitations were placed on the possibility of human rights organizations accompanying and becoming third parties to human rights in human rights cases, limiting the defense of victims in these cases. And then there were laws having to do with national sovereignty and self-determination in 2010. From there, we began to see a worsening of this criminalization. Then in 2012, the logic of the internal enemy was introduced with much greater strength, and accusations against human rights defenders and organizations, tying them to organized crime and terrorism financing, with using a law that was adopted that year to do so. And then, as of 2016, a state of emergency decree went into effect, the justification of which is based on supposedly protecting the state from those internal and external enemies who seek to destabilize the country. And here, I should note that from 2016 to date, more than 5 years later, we remain under a state of emergency. And since March of 2020, in addition, there is a state of alarm, which has also facilitated the implementation of authoritarian measures that facilitate greater social control and greater repression, among others, against human rights defenders and human rights organizations. And in the framework of the state of emergency and state of alarm provisions, measures have been implemented such as the Zamora civic and military plan, or the creation of socio-political action networks, the formalization of the popular system of protection, or people system of protection for peace, so that those parallel state structures can also be used to carry out the most violent actions that are committed against individuals and organizations, particularly in more vulnerable sectors and communities, as they perpetrate more violent actions, such as acts of intimidation, physical attacks, threats on life and integrity. But in the last quarter of 2020, we saw how this logic of the internal enemy and criminalization has been reinforced, not only directed against human rights organizations, but also against those who are carrying out humanitarian work. Not only the traditional humanitarian organizations, but also those human rights organizations who, because of the complex humanitarian emergency, have had to diversify their actions so as to also provide assistance in the context of the socioeconomic crisis that is prevailing in the country. And we see how in October 2020, the Foreign Ministry, together with the Ministry of Internal Relations, issued a joint statement to regulate international organizations not domiciled in the country, and that had an impact on those international organizations that are on the ground in the context of the humanitarian response. Then in November, we saw the issuance of a resolution by the National Banking Superintendency, which facilitates oversight and monitoring of the accounts of human rights organizations and foundations. We also saw last year 5 threats by high-level state officials to adopt and implement a law on international cooperation to punish international human rights organizations that considered to be engaged in destabilizing activities. And this initiative is nothing new. Since at least 2005, efforts have been made to adopt this law. First in 2005, 2006, then in 2015, these efforts were taken up once again. And in early March, in the context of the plan of legislative reforms by the Unconstitutional National Assembly that was elected last December, these efforts were taken up once again. And it's possible that this year we may see the adoption of an instrument such as this, as we've already seen in cases such as Guatemala and Nicaragua. These could have a major impact on the organization's activities. These are all in addition to the creation of the anti-terrorist group, which was created in February 2020, which has been active in many of the facts that we've documented, for example, in attacks or for searches of organizations such as one providing food assistance in Caracas. Another example in December of 2020, and this gives you a general overview of how this whole regulatory system, which also includes the law against hatred and also regulations to limit the possibility of organizations becoming registered, among other measures. All of this works like all of the institutional structure that facilitates repression, that facilitates criminalization, and also in a hostile, adverse environment because of the complex humanitarian emergency aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic, where, moreover, there's no mechanism, public policy, or resource or to promote the work of human rights defenders, or that facilitates their work and that would allows them to denounce and investigate violations against them. This is the situation in which, or the context in which we see the criminalization, and the context in which there's been a stepped up attacks that we've documented, to the point of us documenting 181 situations in the first quarter of this year, which is a 256% increase in relation to the first quarter of 2020. Thank you. Thank you, Marianna. We remind you that you can ask your questions in the Facebook chat, and you can also download the report there. We're going to continue with Mary in the second part, asking, well, mindful of your extensive experience, Mary, in working with human rights defenders from frontline defenders, and at this time in the rapporteurship, what should the role of the international community be, in your view, when it comes to protecting human rights defenders in the organizations in which they work?
Thank you. That's always the question, isn't it? What you can expect from whom? And of course, the international community has a role to play. And by that, I'm talking about people like special rapporteurs in the UN, commissioners in the inter-American system, states themselves, individual states, including when they come together in regional or international fora. And it can also mean international civil society and donor organizations. So I suppose the kind of support could be, on the one hand, well, before that, the role really has to be decided by what the human rights defender says that they need themselves, because they're best placed to know what the risks are for them, what kind of risks they're able to absorb, and what kind of support they need. So I think that is the first thing that needs to be done. The human rights defenders need to be listened to, and their experience of managing their own risks needs to form the basis of developing some support. And then after that, I suppose you can have a mix of practical measures, for example. So one of the things that I've always been very hot on is temporary humanitarian visas. So, for example, Spain has a program for human rights defenders, and that is something that more states should be able to do. Because defending human rights is emotionally and physically draining, and such programs allow defenders to have a break and recover their strength before going home and continuing their work. And they can also acquire new skills. And for example, in Ireland, we set up we lobbied and got, when I was director, a 3-month humanitarian visa scheme from the Irish government, which is accelerated. So again, it allows defenders to come and maybe learn English or just take a complete break, or whatever it is they say that they want. In interest-based fora like the Human Rights Council, you're kind of limited as a special rapporteur in what you can do. You have a mandate, and basically what it comes down to is 2 country visits a year, meeting with human rights defenders, and writing a report to the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. And then the main tool is what are called communications, which are formal letters to governments, to the permanent missions in Geneva about the situation of human rights defenders. And I take a people-centered approach, and civil society and human rights defenders and international organizations make a complaint to the inbox of the special rapporteur, and then depending on how much I can manage, I take up that complaint. I also am systematically trying to go through all the permanent missions, asking for meetings with the ambassadors to explain, first, I think a really important thing is to reinforce with every state that the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders was agreed in 1998. We all know what a human rights defender is. We know the difference between a terrorist and a human rights defender. We know the difference between somebody who is motivated by politics and not human rights. And we have to keep reminding states that they agreed to this declaration after 13 years negotiation. So that is something that I'm trying to push in my particular role. Again, cases of reprisals for cooperating with the UN system have to be a red line. So I would encourage anyone who is experiencing reprisals or to contact the website. The other thing is what we're trying to do, at least I'm only speaking for myself here, I'm trying to build up some states that will be friends of the mandate from different regions who understand that human rights defenders deserve recognition, visibility, and protection, and should be enabled to be able to do their work peacefully. So I'm trying to see what states would be willing to take up the issue of human rights defenders. And I think it's something that everyone has to do. Your networks are the most important. Who you have who will work in solidarity with you within the human rights defender community, but also identifying embassies and states and any body that you could count on to help you. And then, of course, there's the Universal Periodic Review. And that is somewhere where we should be trying to get states to raise the situation of human rights defenders, both broadly and by highlighting individual cases. And some states are good at this, others aren't. And I think this can contribute to the recognition of human rights defenders. But then when it comes to, sustainability for the work of human rights defenders, I think international organizations have an obligation to support defenders by creating long-term links with them, and also introducing them to donors so that they can develop their own links with donors, and donors should be supporting the work of human rights defenders on an ongoing basis and not just project by project. Thank you.
Gracias, Mary. Bueno, a continuación, entonces.
Thank you, Mary. Next, we have
Tenemos una pregunta.
next is a question from well, let me get through this round first. Geoff, mindful of WOLA's experience in supporting civil society organizations in Venezuela, what kind of actions do you think could be taken by other organizations in the region and relevant actors to continue strengthening the Venezuelan organizations in their work? It's a good question. As I said at the outset, I think that more solidarity could be shown with Venezuelan activists such as Marianna, yourself, Ligia, Ezequiel, obviously. I think one good way to do it would be with bilateral advocacy with our own governments, that is to say, showing that one must have active diplomacy following the situation in Venezuela and insisting on restoration of democratic institutions in the country and denouncing and offering incentives for the repression of human rights defenders to halt. More than anything else, I think that more could be done with political actors who define themselves as being on the left. I think that the left has a special responsibility in the hemisphere, mainly because I think that there are political actors who might be tempted to view the crisis through a superficial ideological lens. I think that there's been some progress in that regard. For example, in the United States, in the Progressive Caucus in the US Congress, we have seen important statements recognizing the reality that in Venezuela, there's no rule of law, that there need to be free and fair elections. In recent days, we saw international statements by Peruvian candidate, the presidential candidate, Veronica Mendoza, recognizing that in Venezuela there is a dictatorship. There were all similar statements made by actors such as the former president of Uruguay, Pepe Mujica, who is a key authority for those who consider themselves on the left in the hemisphere. So I think that greater emphasis needs to be played on the defense of human rights as a moral principle instead of seeing what's happening in Venezuela through an ideological lens. In that regard, if one could see if there's more that could be done with key countries in the hemisphere, such as the government of Mexico, the government of Argentina, and others who could play an important role facilitating a consistent regional response to the human rights crisis in Venezuela. Thanks very much. Thank you, Geoff. And to close out the second round, I would like to turn to the author of this research study, Ezequiel. In this research study on defending human rights, we find that despite this very complex context in which the organizations must work, they themselves have implemented strategies of resistance. Could you talk to us about these strategies and the recommendations that emerged from your research study for civil society actors in the region? Thank you, Ligia. In effect, one of the most interesting and most relevant discoveries in this work is the whole strategy of resistance that has been used by civil society organizations in Venezuela to resist. That's what they do by these mechanisms, they resist. And what we find is that these mechanisms don't necessarily allow us to go forward. We also find that the resistance is in the framework of a great collective energy of the Venezuelan organizations, which translates into support for democracy. We all have that innate desire, as Geoff was saying. In effect, in Venezuela, we are experiencing a dictatorship, and it's a very difficult to work in the context of a dictatorship. That is clear all the time. It stands out more and more independent of the political ideology of whoever says it, but it is a reality that requires that we reflect. And each organization works to pursue its specific objectives. Now, in the study, we identified three main blocks of resistance or resilience that have helped us to withstand the crisis. I think the main one is resilience in the face of the humanitarian emergency, in the face of the lack of fuel, electricity, and the emergency we're experiencing. The responses has been creative. Some really deserve a medal. They've been heroic. Some organizations confessed that they installed showers in the spaces where they work because of the crisis in water supply. And so we need to acknowledge those who've adapted to these circumstances. This also has to do with transport, hiring of private transport. These strategies of resistance imply many costs, which are difficult to take on given limited financing. Second, attacks on security and integrity. I think that in our DNA, we have something which is genetic, which is that we've been able to get through so many attacks and acts of intimidation against our work. Sometimes we are approached, such as the episode known as Azul Positivo, but where attacks are actually carried out, we also have strategies for resistance and resilience. One of these is the massive solidarity that exists among the organizations when a defender is attacked. In the case of Provea, Azul Positivo, and one other, if they affect one of us, then they're affecting all of us. Strengthening of networks among the organizations is extremely important. We notice that increasingly we are doing that. Also, some organizations have had to change their web domain so often in order to get around censorship, which is a major problem in Venezuela: censorship, limitations on freedom of expression, and of course, security protocols, which are confidential, and that the organizations design in order to deal with situations such as lack of communication. And a third strategy of resilience are the professional and emotional forms of support that the organizations have adopted so that we don't go crazy. One time you see in social media networks, anyone might say anything. And in the face of the context, we were in the context of the pandemic, we were sort of going crazy. And second of all, the recommendations mentioned by Ligia. Well, I think one of the positives of this work, we divided these into two parts. One geared to civil society in the region, like WOLA and De Justicia, and others geared to collaborators or persons who want to support our organizations economically, I'm speaking of mainly. Now, for the civil society organizations, recommendations are as follows. First, more assertive and direct communication. In the findings in the text, many persons interviewed mentioned that sometimes communications aren't assertive. They imply expenditures, they take time that could be taken up on other aspects. Also, lasting partnerships is another effective measure. It's even though it is desirable that there be joint publications, we really are interested more in long-term partnerships. There are some weaknesses identified, such as gender, education, and human rights, that are at risk of being extinguished. As lawyers and law professors, we've realized that in law studies, law studies are on the way to extinction. Fewer and fewer people are signing up to study law, and I think this is a concern at many of the universities across the country. Finally, foster new partnerships, generating an initial contact. We are tied in now to De Justicia, and this relationship can lead to other partnerships. And the recommendations for collaborators or supporters include that there should be institutional financing, but long-term institutional financing, if at all possible, 2 to 3 years, allowing us to strengthen in order to give impetus to the issues that we're working on. Also, we ask the funders to be more flexible in their requirements, which can be very difficult for us to comply with. One person interviewed said that one of the funders said, do take photographs of the work you're doing. Well, taking photographs of human rights defenders or activists in the context of the human rights work, persons involved in criminal justice defense. Well, this is difficult because it poses risks for the life and work of the human rights defenders. Also, partnerships with new allies. I think that's very important. And finally, direct support for human rights defenders. We think that that would be a very good recommendation, not only to cut short the time that it can take to get support to a human rights organization, but also there are fellowships and the like that could help a human rights defender have some rest from the work and take a different perspective. I had the opportunity to be in such a fellowship, and it gave me the opportunity to see the situation in Venezuela from another perspective. That's very positive. I think if you stay in Venezuela, you get so sucked in by the crisis, and so you can actually do more effective work by stepping outside sometimes. That, in general lines, would be it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ezequiel. Let's go straight to the questions because we're now running out of time. we have 4 questions, and maybe one panelist should answer each one. Beginning with Mary, there's a specific question. Does the Office of the High Commissioner play an important role in protecting civic space and space for human rights defenders in Venezuela? And Mary, what do you think of the actions that have been taken by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights thus far related to this issue?
I'm afraid I have to go now, and I'm not in a position to answer that because I haven't studied what actions that she has taken. I have been in the mandate since last May, and I don't know the history of the UN engagement with Venezuela. But all I would say is that you have to keep pushing, and you have to keep banging on all the doors, because there are so many countries around the world where human rights defenders are at risk, and everybody is trying to get attention. So you have to be very, very persistent. So I'm sorry, I can't really say any more than that, because I am not aware of the ins and outs of her engagement. So I'm really sorry. I have another meeting now, and I'm 5 minutes late for it, so I better go. But thank you all very much.
Muchas gracias a ti, Mary. Te reconocemos como nuestra embajadora.
Thank you, Mary, so much. We recognize you as our ambassador at the United Nations, and we know that you'll continue to be so and do so. Thank you so much for participating today.
Bueno, seguimos entonces con las siguientes preguntas.
Very well, we'll continue with the next questions.
Tenemos una que podría responder Geoff.
There's one that Geoff could answer. And like Mary, just 1 or 2 minutes for the answer because we're running late. Could you say something about how the amendment to the law on international cooperation that the National Assembly is trying to modify once again, as in the case of the previous ones, would impact the work of human rights defenders in Venezuela and civil society organizations? And also, if you know what is being done at the United Nations in this regard, we know that the reform will also limit humanitarian assistance work. Well, I think that the question has part of the answer in it. If the reforms being discussed could have an impact on civil society, both human rights organizations as well as the humanitarian actors who are partners of the UN itself and its humanitarian response to the country. Now, if I'm not mistaken, there is a law at this time, the 2010 law, which is law in defense of political sovereignty and national self-determination. In its text, it limits access to international support for NGOs and international actors, but to date, there's been a lack of political will on the part of the regime, the de facto government, when it comes to implementing that law or enforcing it. So yes, we're very concerned about that debate and its possible impacts on the necessary work of civil society when it comes to defending human rights in Venezuela. Thank you, Geoff. Marianna, there's also a question specifically for you. It says, when you refer to specific situations with a negative impact on human rights work in Venezuela in the first quarter of Venezuela, what actions are you referring to specifically, and what were the most common? Thank you, Ligia. Yes, as we had been saying, the main attacks and acts of obstruction directed against human rights defenders in the country are acts geared to stigmatize their work. And of late, we have seen an increase in more violent actions, from arbitrary searches to initiating prosecutions, all of that in the logic of the internal enemy and the criminalization of the work of defending and demanding human rights in the country. We should recall that in the context of the ever greater restrictions on the civic and democratic space, and also mindful of the impact of the complex humanitarian crisis on the possibility of fully engaging in legitimate activities in the context of defense and promotion of human rights. Well, when a human rights defender is attacked, when the work of an organization is obstructed, not only is that institution or individual affected, also affected are the victims who are left without protection in the context of impunity. And our appeal as an organization is that there is an immediate cessation of all criminalization and acts of harassment, because the defense of human rights is recognized in international law. It's recognized by the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, and defending human rights, engaging in humanitarian action is not a crime and does not have to be criminalized. Thank you, Marianna, and finally, Ezequiel. It's said that since so many civil society organizations are intimidated and threatened, and international financing is limited, what would be the best way to support them without endangering human rights defenders? And are there formal or informal mechanisms for protection? Please go ahead. Thank you, Ligia. One of the main concerns we detected in the interviews and also in the day-to-day activity of the human rights defenders is this anguish of not being able to transmit information directly, particularly about who finances them and how they're financed, not because they're financed by the DEA or the FBI, but rather just to, even if you say that you're financed by any international organization, then you're considered to be working in some criminal manner. So this is really an unsustainable situation, because we human rights defenders want to professionalize ourselves. We want to work in a professional way and not to be limited to being volunteers. Now, so the recommendations we make to funding sources include that funding should be discreet. It should be discreet but hard-hitting. This is not just that I'm afraid that something might happen to me because of some sanctions being imposed, or something might happen to you because you finance, but rather they should be discreet and they should be very effective. If possible, it's best to not publish what organizations you are financing in Venezuela. Well, it seems that we've lost Ezequiel. Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah, can you hear me? Yes, we hear you fine, Ligia. Okay, the problem's with Ezequiel. Well, if he reconnects, we could give him 30 seconds to close out, but at any event, we're now wrapping it up. And I just wanted to add that precisely due to the polarization in Venezuela and the transfer of that polarization or mapping of it internationally, sometimes there is no solidarity with human rights organizations in Venezuela on the part of their peers in the region, because the idea is if we criticize Maduro, we must be right-wingers. So this Manichean situation makes life very complicated for us. And in that regard, it's important to value and express gratitude for the fact that organizations such as De Justicia and WOLA have not fallen into that trap, and to the contrary, not only do not share in that black and white way of looking at things, but in addition, they have developed a strategy of solidarity with the human rights movement of Venezuela, which is very valuable. So I remind you that the link is up if you wish to download the report. And we're also grateful for the presence of other organizations of the region. And we hope that you keep the Venezuelan organizations on your radar. Ezequiel, we're winding it up. I don't know if you want to say anything by way of a final message. No, I was able to finish what I was saying before the connection broke down, which is something we've been experiencing in Venezuela. I'd like to thank all the participants, the co-authors of this book, Ligia, Lucia, and others who have Corredor, who participated in this book. This is an initiative of our own. So I'd like to thank all of the presenters, the participants, and certainly will be in touch for future partnerships. I too would like to thank all of those present, the panelists, particularly our interpreter, and we'll continue meeting in spaces such as this to